All right, Alexander, we have done countless videos on NATO and Russia with regards to Ukraine and Ukraine joining NATO. We've talked about that possibility and how it's led to uh, tensions, to say the least, between Russia and NATO, Russia, Europe, Russia, and the United States. So we've covered NATO, the southern, say the southern part of Europe, possibly expanding, NATO expanding into the southern part of Europe, and maybe NATO expanding into the Caucasus with Georgia. Perhaps we've talked about that as well, but not many people talk about the other part of NATO expansion, and that comes in the form of the north of Europe, and there we're looking at Finland and Sweden. And we've had some statements, some recent statements from top commanders in the Swedish military who have encouraged NATO and the United States to build up their forces in order to counter Russian aggression, as they call it, and the fact that Russia wants to invade Europe for some strange reason. And we have a statement from the Finnish prime minister who has said that Finland, and I'm quoting, Finland retains the option of applying for NATO membership. And the prime minister said this during a New Year's message, Prime Minister Sanna Marin. And she emphasized this point that Finland is open to perhaps joining the alliance. Of course, they cooperate. I mean, Sweden and Finland cooperate with NATO on a regular basis. I mean, they're kind of, in a way, de facto members in a way, but they are not true members of the alliance. And I think many people don't look at these two countries joining NATO and what that means for Russia and the pushback that Russia is going to give should either Sweden or Finland or both decide to take the plunge and go full into the alliance as full members. Of course, if anyone's been to proximity, just to wrap it up, Alexander, if anyone's been to St. Petersburg, you do get an understanding just how close Russia is, or St. Petersburg is, to Finland and to Scandinavia. Of course, you can talk a little bit about the history there. It is the city of Peter the Great, and Peter built that city in order to have access to the north of Europe. So I mean, it's, you visit St. Petersburg and you understand that Finland, Scandinavia is literally just a few hundred miles away, and there are security risks there and security concerns for all sides involved. What are your thoughts on Finland, Sweden, the recent statements with regards to NATO and NATO
Absolutely,
expansion?
absolutely. Now, can I just say a few things? I mean, the first to begin, I mean, Sweden and Finland, they're both Scandinavian countries, but they're two Scandinavian countries which have never particularly got on or liked each other. Finland, for a very long time, was part of the Kingdom of Sweden. Sweden was the sort of ruling power. And within Finland itself, there is a Swedish community which still controls much of the economy. It's quite small, but it controls much of the economy. And if you go to Helsinki, which I visited, by the way, several times, beautiful city, incidentally. If you go to Helsinki, the capital of Finland, you see that street signs are in Swedish and Finnish, and there's been this tension because there's been this sort of resentment on the part of some Finns towards Sweden. This feeling that the Swedes still have a predominant position in Finnish economic life. And you do get this sort of feeling amongst Finns. Now, Finland has also had a very, very complicated relationship with Russia. Finland became a part of the Russian Empire in the 19th century. Actually, it wasn't technically part of the Russian Empire, but there was a war between Russia and Sweden at the start of the 19th century. Finland then became a Grand Duchy independent of Sweden, but the Tsar of Russia became the Grand Duke, and Finland operated as a kind of autonomous state, but under overall Russian control throughout the 19th century. Then, when the Russian monarchy collapsed as a result of the October Revolution, the Russian Revolution, sorry, not the October Revolution, the Russian Revolution, Finland became completely independent of Russia. There was a lot of tension because there was issues over the border, and you can absolutely rightly say Finland is very, very close to Russia. And the result was a war that was fought between the Soviet Union and Finland in 1939, which ended with the Soviets gaining control of large areas of what had been Finland, Karelia, and a town called Viipuri, now Viborg, within Russia. And there's been resentments amongst Finns, at least some Finns, about that also. But also there have been incredibly strong connections. So you go to Helsinki, the city's been very heavily built. The centre was built in the 19th century in a very Petersburgian style. During the Cold War, when people did films about the Russian Revolution, they were always filmed in St. Petersburg, in Helsinki, because it's so like St. Petersburg in so many ways. The railway station in Helsinki is a magnificent granite building with an elegant section which is the Finnish president's particular section. But it was originally built for the Tsar. So there's these very strong connections. And after the Second World War, Finland and the Soviet Union became very close. So though Finland was a democracy, and it maintained a very friendly and very close connection with the Soviet Union. And the Soviets heavily invested in the Finnish economy, buying things like icebreakers, timber, and all the rest from Finland. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the resentments towards Russia, which had always been there bubbling under the surface, bobbed up, and Finland became for a time much more antagonistic to Russia. And there was a Finnish politician called Martti Ahtisaari, who for a time became quite influential in Finnish politics, and he sort of wanted to revisit the border changes that had been made as a result of the Finnish-Soviet War of 1939. But he's somewhat lost influence. But the result is that Finland, if you go to Finland today, you can find these divisions between some Finns who are wary of Sweden, want to maintain good relations with Russia. The Finnish timber industry faces strong competition from the Russian timber industry, and it's very important in Finland. So they want to have good relations with Russia to limit Russian exports of timber so as to protect the Finnish timber industry. There's been detailed negotiations about this. Finland continues to supply many goods to Russia, a legacy of the Cold War era. So there's some Finns who want good relations with Russia. There are other Finns who remain resentful of the way in which Finland was defeated by the Soviets in 1939, lost territory as a result of the war of 1939, and at the same time feel that they have a much closer relationship ultimately to the West. So you have these tensions. So on the one hand, you have the current Finnish president, Sauli Niinisto, who seems to want good relations with Russia. And you have the Finnish prime minister, who, on the contrary, leans towards the West. And you have also had this big deal to buy F-35 fighter jets from the United States. That's the sort of pro-Western side in Finnish politics, if you like, becoming stronger. But at the same time, the Finnish president meets with Putin, and he seems to be much more understanding of Russian concerns. And he's been giving interviews to places like the London Times, in which he says that we have to understand that Russia does have valid security concerns. So that's Finland. Sweden, it's different. Now, the thing to understand about Sweden is that the Swedes and the Russians have never particularly got on, and they've never particularly liked each other. St. Petersburg, the city you've just mentioned, was built by Peter the Great on territory Russia captured from Sweden as a result of what was called the Great Northern War of the early 18th century. And there's been several wars between Russia and Sweden, in which the Russians were consistently victorious. One of those was the war which resulted in Sweden losing control of Finland. So there's always been this resentment in Sweden towards Russia, and there's always been, and you find Swedish politicians like the former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt, who are fundamentally extremely antagonistic towards Russia. And though Sweden never joined NATO during the Cold War, it was a well-known fact that to all intents and purposes throughout the Cold War, it was deeply integrated at a military level in NATO's military structures. It was nominally neutral, but in practice it was deeply aligned to the West. Now, these moves by Sweden and Finland to edge towards NATO, or at least by some political leaders within Sweden and Finland to edge towards NATO, I think what they are is a reflection of the alarm that increasing numbers of West European politicians, in fact, European politicians, are manifesting as we see negotiations between the Americans and the Russians on strategic stability get underway. The Russians have produced these draft treaties for what is in effect a rollback of NATO's eastward expansion. They want NATO's expansion to be entirely stopped, not just its eastward expansion, but its entire expansion to be stopped. And a lot of Europeans are starting to get increasingly worried that the US, feeling itself under pressure from China in the Pacific, is becoming less interested in Europe, might be interested ultimately in cutting a deal with Russia, perhaps not quite on the extent that the Russians are saying. And we see these politicians, we see this with Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, who, remember, is a Scandinavian. He's from Norway. We see people like Josep Borrell, the EU High Representative. They're saying, these Russian proposals are unacceptable. We've got to continue to expand both the EU and NATO forever. And we see that Finnish and Swedish politicians of the same sort of outlook are now coming out, and military officials are coming out with similar statements. Again, as I said, because they're nervous, they're becoming nervous that the geostrategic picture in Europe is starting to change. So a history lesson, if you like, and at the same time, if I can say, an explanation of these particular moves. The Russians, to say it very quickly, have acted extremely negatively to these proposals, to these comments by Sweden and Finland. There have been some very strong statements from the Russian Foreign Ministry, and the Swedes perhaps can to some extent afford to ignore them. But Finland, which, as I said, has a very complex relationship with Russia, and which is to a great extent still economically interconnected with Russia, I doubt that it can. So it's possible that we'll see a Swedish drift towards NATO, but it's, I think, unlikely that we will see a Finland follow.
Okay, let me read you a statement from the Swedish Armed Forces Supreme Commander General Mikael Biden, B-Y-D-E-N, Biden or Biden? I don't know, but a different Biden, B-Y-D-E-N. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that.
Well, the Bidens get everywhere, obviously. Anyway, carry on.
Exactly. Maybe there's some relation to Joe, but anyway, he is the Swedish Armed Forces Supreme Commander. And he said that in no uncertain terms that the United States should, the U.S. specifically, should significantly beef up its presence in Europe if the conflict between Russia and Ukraine escalates. And I quote, if the situation, I wouldn't say require, because that's the wrong word, but if the situation would worsen, I do believe it would be good to have a bigger footprint. This is what Biden said to Politico during an interview, and Biden suggested that the U.S. troops should be sent to existing U.S. facilities in Europe. Quote, because you have bases in Europe, it's not like you're not there. It's more like reinforce what you have, more people, more capabilities. My question is it possible that Sweden were to take the plunge and join NATO and Finland not join NATO? Is that a possibility? Is this supreme commander perhaps saying, you know what, we're ready to reinforce troops, NATO troops and U.S. troops where you have bases, but Sweden is also ready to welcome forces? And should a scenario like that take place, where one of the two does eventually join NATO, or even both of them end up joining NATO, what kind of a risk is that to Russia? Is that really a risk? Because maybe Russia just brushes it off, or is this really a big security concern? Because you have now Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and then the only part that's missing is the southern flank, and that is Ukraine. And then Russia on its west is completely, from top to bottom, completely covered with NATO forces right on their doorstep.
Right, Russia can live with Sweden in NATO. As I said, in practice, during the Cold War, Sweden, though nominally neutral, was pretty aligned with NATO. For the Russians, Finland joining NATO would be a critically dangerous thing, comparable in some respects to Ukraine joining NATO. I think the Russians will make it absolutely crystal clear to the Americans that it is a red line, for exactly the reason you said. If you travelled from Helsinki to St. Petersburg, you will see why. The distance between the two is extremely short, and of course many Russians in St. Petersburg remember the siege of Leningrad of 1941 to 44, in which St. Petersburg, Leningrad as it then was encircled by the Nazi German and Finnish armies. The Finns were allies of the Germans during the Second World War, and around 1 million people died of famine, of starvation in Leningrad before the siege was eventually broken by the Red Army. So this is an incredibly sensitive issue for the Russians, and I think that they will never, to be straightforward about it, allow or permit Finland to join NATO. I think that if that possibility were ever really made serious, then we would see the Russians respond to that almost as strongly, in fact, as strongly as they have responded to the issue of Ukraine joining NATO. And of course, if we're talking about the F-35 sale to Finland, for the Russians, that comes very close already to crossing a red line. To be honest about it, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think Finland is going to take that risk. I think that for the Finns to align themselves so openly with the West by joining NATO and invite the kind of retaliation from Russia that would follow, I think too many Finns. Finland understands Russia very well. I mean, there's lots of Russians in Finland. There's lots of Finns who travel to Russia. I think that Finland would not take that plunge. Sweden is another matter. As I said, the Swedes are more likely to do it. Again, for historic reasons, I don't think they would. I think the Swedish military, which has always been, to be straightforward about it, staffed by officers who are very hostile to Russia and who, are brought up with the military history of Sweden and who know about Sweden's defeats at the hands of Russia in multiple wars. I think the Swedes would be, I think even in Sweden, such a move to end Sweden's long history of neutrality would be extremely controversial. But the Swedish military chief's comments, Mr. General Biden's comments, what I think they really reflect are not real concern about a war in Ukraine. What the general's words reflect is worry, and it's a general worry about people of a neocon or neoliberal or militaristic anti-Russian tendency across Europe. That the US, faced with all these demands from Russia, for legally binding security guarantees and an end to NATO's eastward expansion, that the US, instead of simply saying these proposals are unacceptable and throwing them into a trash can, is instead sitting down and negotiating with the Russians. And that's making many people of that kind of tendency, that kind of outlook in Europe extremely nervous, because, of course, they know perfectly well that if the United States were to pull out of Europe or reduce significantly its military footprint in Europe, then, of course, that would leave Russia as overwhelmingly the dominant military power in Europe. And if you are a hardline anti-Russian Swedish general, that is extremely worrying for you. So that's what this all reflects. As I said, nervousness. There is very real nervousness in Europe about these negotiations between the Americans and the Russians that are now about to get underway. Whether that nervousness is founded in any realities, whether the US is really contemplating any of the concessions that these people fear, well, that's another matter. But you can already see that the mere fact that such negotiations are taking place at all is making people in Europe nervous. And the fact that the US has ruled out any military response to a war between Russia and Ukraine, any military defense of Ukraine, that is making them nervous also, because they say, well, if the US cannot defend Ukraine, will it defend us? So you can see that these rather hardline comments, they show, what they really show is how uneasy some people in Europe are becoming.
Could I also throw in another caveat as to why they may be so pro-NATO and pro-building up forces? One is Sweden is a major arms manufacturer. I believe it has a very, very developed military-industrial complex, very developed. It's really interesting because people never really think of Sweden and its MIC industry, but they do have one, and it's a good one. So maybe there's something there. And the other part, which is just more interesting, which maybe you want to reflect on to close out the video, I believe the last two NATO leaders were from Scandinavia. I believe Denmark and Stoltenberg is Norway. And now I hear there are rumors that Stoltenberg will go back to Norway and be the leader of the central bank, which is just, okay, revolving door. But that's what they're saying. But it's kind of interesting that Scandinavia does, at least in the leadership role, is so prominent in NATO.
Absolutely, that's absolutely correct. Now, let's talk about the Swedish MIC. The Swedish MIC is huge by relative to the size of Sweden's economy, and you get all these important Swedish companies that produce all these impressive weapon systems. Sweden has built its own tanks, its own fighter jets, its own anti-aircraft systems, all kinds of things. The problem it's been having is that, of course, it's been finding it very difficult increasingly to compete. And the Swedish MIC has been strained. So it needs a market. And, of course, what it's found is that NATO states don't procure Swedish military equipment because Sweden is outside NATO. Whenever there's been ideas for it, I remember some years back, there was the idea was floated of Greece buying, for example, Gripen fighters, Swedish fighters from Sweden, fighter jets. But of course, that didn't actually happen because Sweden was outside NATO. I can remember even further back, the Greek communist leader, a man called Florakis. I'm sure you remember him. He was proposing that Greece buy fighter jets, vegan fighter jets, from Sweden, again because Sweden was outside NATO. But precisely because Sweden was outside NATO, Sweden can't sell its military products to any great extent to other NATO powers. So, of course, there's always this lobby within Sweden which says, well, look, we've got to get around this problem. The MIC in Sweden is a very important part of our economy. It's actually disproportionately important part of our economy. We can't sustain it on our own resources. We're finding it increasingly difficult to compete internationally. So let's join NATO. And that will mean that NATO countries will start to buy our fighter jets, our tanks, and all the rest, because up to now we've been barred from selling them. And that lobby does exist, no question about it. In practice, the reality is that, with the exception of France, every country in NATO that has had its own MIC, Britain is a good case in point, has found it impossible to compete against the US. So I doubt that it would provide the salvation to this Swedish MIC, as some people in Sweden might think it does. But that thinking undoubtedly is there. So that does play, undoubtedly, unquestionably, a significant role. Now, you do find in Scandinavia, coming back to your earlier question, you do find in Scandinavia some extremely anti-Russian politicians. Stoltenberg in Norway, who's the current Secretary General, who has been apparently shunted aside. Some people find him too extreme, even for them. So he's going to be made governor of the Norwegian Central Bank, apparently. And of course, before that, there was Rasmussen from Denmark, who was every bit as hardline as Stoltenberg is. And you've got other people like Carl Bildt, the Swedish foreign minister, as I said, who is very, very hardline anti-Russian, and Ahtisaari from Finland. The reason you get these very hardline people in Scandinavia is, of course, that Russia is far and away the most powerful country in the Baltics. And they're always nervous, and you get these people and then, by the way, they're not right-wing or left-wing. Stoltenberg is associated with the Swedish Labour Party. The Norwegian Labour Party. He's on the left, and so was Rasmussen in Denmark, whereas Carl Bildt is on the right, for example. But you get these Scandinavian politicians who are terrified that if the United States pulls out of Europe or de-escalates its position in Europe, the Russians will become the dominant power in the Baltics. And that, of course, makes politicians of that particular outlook extremely anti-Russian. Now, I don't think that everybody in Scandinavia thinks like that. As I understand it, in Norway, which is, of course, not strictly speaking a Baltic country, or not to any great extent, but in Norway, I understand actually, attitudes to Russia amongst a lot of people are generally fairly positive. It's a fairly peaceful border. And in Finland, I know for a fact that attitudes of some Finns, not all Finns, to Russia are positive also. So you get a range of attitudes, that there is a section of the political class in all of these countries that is very, very nervous of the bear next door. And that's perhaps not entirely surprising, but of course they take it to an extreme point, and in my opinion, they are going in diametrically the opposite direction. They should be aiming, especially given their proximity to Russia, for good relations with Russia, not these hostile ones that some of them have been following. Once upon a time, Scandinavian politicians of a different sort, like the Finnish president Urho Kekkonen, who was the dominant political figure in Finland for decades after the end of the Second World War, and the Swedish Prime Minister Tage Erlander, who was the dominant social democrat Swedish politician in the 60s. They sought good relations with Russia, the Soviet Union as it then was. And I think that was a good policy for Scandinavia, and it's a policy that perhaps ought to be better followed today. But, you know, liberal neocons, neoliberals,
Neolibs,
they're very strong, exact neolibs, they're very strong in Scandinavia too. And with the end of the memories of the Second World War, with this new generation of politicians who has come up, the sort of visceral feelings of nervousness and hostility to the bear next door, that's come, unfortunately, up to the surface, and is leading. It produces odd politicians like Stoltenberg and Rasmussen and Bildt and all the others.
Yeah. Yep. Well said. All right. Let's leave it there. The Duran.locals.com. Go to Odyssey, BitChute, Rumble, and SuperU to find all our videos on those platforms. We are also now on Getter, by the way. We are on Getter. You can look for us there. Just search the Duran. And also the Duran shop. 10% off when you use the code GOODDAY, as advertised on that mug. Good day. Use that code and get 10% off all merchandise. Take care.